I've been pondering this afternoon the circumstances in which we're currently living, where we're currently still not allowed to return to church in Nevada under the governor's order to not congregate in groups over a certain number in size so that we don't spread infection. Despite the fact that this seems contradictory when there are riots and protests going on that are much larger than this, there is the bigger point here of that juxtaposed opposite the president who made the claim it's time to go back to church. And that's sort of ironically timed given what this week's Sunday school lesson would have been about if I were at church. The Sunday school lesson covers Alma chapters 5 through 7. And in those chapters there are two things that occur that are relevant to the current situation. So we'll go through them linearly and try to cover everything that needs to be covered. So in Alma chapter 5, Alma asks some questions about the conversion status of the people to whom he is preaching. And if you have felt to feel the Spirit, can you feel so now? I know a lot of Christians, and this is probably my biggest criticism of so-called self-identifying Christians, who believe that once they become a Christian, all of a sudden they're whitewashed of all responsibility and accountability for everything else that they do. You walk around and you hear them say things like, I know the day on which I was saved, as if now they've been saved and it doesn't matter what they will do. It's interesting that this attitude is confronted by Alma because hundreds of years earlier, Nephi encountered the same problem, where there would be people who would say, there is no God, but if there is, sin a little, because if there is one, God will beat us with a few stripes, and at last we will be saved. It's the wrong attitude. It's the wrong attitude. Being a Christian is not, something that you achieve, like, getting an Eagle Scout or getting promoted to CEO or elected president. It's not like reaching a certain rank, becoming a captain in the army. Being a Christian means becoming a follower of Christ. And if you think about what Christians were called in the olden days, there were people who followed Jesus around everywhere that he went because they needed him. They knew that they needed him. They recognized that they needed to follow him, literally. Some of them followed him because he fed them, and they were hungry, and I can understand that. But there were other people among the group, like the woman who reached out and touched him, or Lazarus' sister who came to get him, the man whose son was stricken by a palsy, the leper, there's one other that's a really good example. But these were people who recognized that they needed Jesus in order to set their lives back in order. And they kept following him. And we know that they kept following him because at one point he finally tells them that he's not going to feed them every time, and some of them stopped following him, but not everybody did. And they kept following him around. They kept getting together with him at all times. Jesus even asked his own apostles, will you also go away? And these were people who stuck with him because they realized that we need you every hour. Not just once and, okay, now I'm a Christian and all is good. And if the circumstances of today teach us nothing else, they teach us that morality and integrity and virtue are things that we need. Viral outbreaks, riots, what have you, all of these things bring out either the demon in you or the desire to be a better person. That's what all the trials and circumstances of life are about. They're about revealing who you really are, so you can find out, does this lead to a place where I want to go? And if it doesn't, then where do I need to go instead? So Alma's question is prescient. Can ye feel so now? Are you still converted? Do you still feel it? Do you still, because you're not always going to feel elated. I think it was Neil A. Maxwell who said a testimony is not something that you're going to have forever. Not something that you get once and then that you never lose. And we know that. People apostatize and leave all the time. Even one of the disciples left, betrayed Jesus, and had him, and ultimately led to his death. There are lots of voices competing for our attention. Lots of distractions. The din and dissonance of the devil's disciples constantly distract us from what actually matters. And in this viral pandemic, we've been confined to our houses to ask ourselves what really matters. For my own part, even though there isn't anybody here, I've thought a lot about the people and the things that have mattered. I spent some time this afternoon going through the 3 boxes I have of pictures of my friend Tracy, who was murdered 7 years ago this August. I found some pictures of her when she was a kid. I found some pictures of her with her first kid, with her last husband. I guess it was her second husband. I shouldn't make it sound like she had a ton of them. With her father. And it was interesting to think about her because I think she, more than any other woman I've actually ever known, cared about me. And I don't mean like romantically. And I miss her. I stood in the kitchen briefly a little while ago and looked down at the spot on the kitchen floor where my dog used to stand and look at me, and I miss him. And because I decided to remodel the house, I've seen my dad for 2 or 3 hours every day, almost every day for weeks, when he comes over to help me on stuff. And I've been able to spend a lot of quality time with my dad. And one of the things that will make this most valuable to me is not the added market value that redoing the house will give this house. It's looking around for the next 10 or 20 years or however long it lasts and saying, my dad built that. We did that together. And that's something that matters. Otherwise, it's just stuff. Which segues into a little bit the other topic from Alma's writings that I wanted to discuss. So Alma ends up among the Amalekites, who have built themselves a great tower called the Ramyemptom, where they go up and say a prayer. And the poor people are not allowed to participate in church services, so they go to Alma and they complain and say, well, where do we worship God? And Alma brings up the notion that, if incorrectly interpreted, says you don't need the building. Because he asks them, he says, what is there that says you have to go to this particular building to worship? What is there that says that you only worship once a week? Where does it say that? And there are people who will make the argument that, well, I don't need a church. And these are usually people who've had a bad experience with a church because the church is led by people. Now, I've done some thinking about this for the last year or so, in case it ever came up with my Sunday school class. Over the course of my life, excluding the time I was as a missionary, I've had 20 different bishops or congregational leaders. I can't remember how many congregations I've been in, but I've had 20 different bishops. And some of them are awful. and maybe they were great for other people. Maybe there was a reason they were called and it had nothing to do with me. The last one I had, Bishop Randy, he was spectacular. He was at least in the top 3, if not the top one I've ever had. The one I have now is easily one of the worst. And it isn't because he's an evil man. He's just meh. And there are a lot of people who, if they have a meh experience or if they have a super bad one, will then conclude, well, if the leaders of the church are corrupt, then obviously the church is corrupt and I don't need the church. And almost all of my friends are like that. My best friend told me about a year ago he'd finally decided, after he's 55, he's 55 now, to go back to church. And he said it was an eye-opening experience. And I'm glad he went. He's a Quaker, so we have very different meanings, but I'm glad he went back for his sake, because I believe that Alma is right, that you should go worship. Now, it's a part of the tradition. There's always been an expectation that you go to a place set aside for worship. In the Old Testament times, they had the tabernacle, and they would all go there on the Sabbath, which was Saturday, and they would offer up a sacrifice, and the priest would kill it and bless it, and then they would receive their blessings. It was part of their religious observation. It's always been a part of the Judeo-Christian ethos to attend church or something. Now, there are lots of Christians in air quotes today, who say, well, I don't need a church. I'm just going to go up on the mountain and go to church. And I have to wonder, because they'll say that, and my friend Jay does that, but it's not like we go up there and talk about Jesus. It's not like they go up there and think about it. I mean, periodically he'll say, thank you, Lord, but it's like, I say that every morning in my car when I get in it. For a while, it was because my 24-year-old Saturn, I was just grateful it started. So it's not special. It's not his church. It's a replacement. It's an ersatz, a counterfeit for church. Because even when they didn't have buildings, they would go up on the mountains, and that's his justification. But they would have a special place they would go, and they would build an altar, and that's where they would go. And they would offer up prayers and offer up sacrifices. And that was because there wasn't any organized religion. But since the coming of Christ, that's done away with. At his very last meal, that last night with his disciples, he sat down and instituted the sacrament among them, and said, this ye shall do often, gather together in my name in remembrance of me. Nobody ever does that at their ersatz religious observances, when they're out on the lake in the boat, or up on the mountain, or camping, or at the pool hall, or whatever it is that they do. And truth be told, I don't do that here, mostly because it would be, I feel, inappropriate for me to just give the sacrament to myself because of the symbolism. But that's another story for another time. So it's always been a part of it. But there's nothing that says that you can only worship God on Sunday, or that you can only worship him in a building. But there's also nothing anywhere that says that you shouldn't, or that it's not necessary. As soon as they got to the promised land, they built a temple. And when it was destroyed, they built another one. And even now today, they talk about and yearn for the time when they will rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And they've built churches and synagogues all over the place. Do you need a building? No. You should gather together and pray whenever you want, about whatever you want. And we should always be talking of Christ. I have some relatives who told me that they actually get onto whatever web meeting software that they have and discuss the Sunday school lesson in absentia, in silico, with each other, since they can't meet together, because we could do this. I don't do that with my Sunday school class because it's a bunch of teenagers. And I feel that it would be somewhat inappropriate for me to institute and instigate communication with them, even if it's for this lofty purpose. Because there's nothing that says that it would only be for that purpose, or that everyone participating would have that as their purpose in mind. And so I don't do it. But that's why I made this one. I figured it was time to go back to church, to start having church on Sunday, to start doing something about it, to think about it, to talk about it, to preach of Christ, to prophesy of Christ, to rejoice in Christ, to write of Christ, and so that our children may know to what source they may look for a remission of sins. To know that there is somewhere they can go to put their lives back together. To ask themselves, do you still feel it? Can you still feel it? Can you feel it if you don't go to a building? Can you feel it if you never meet, if you don't get together? Are you motivated of your own will and choice to read, to pray, to study, to make a video and put it on the internet about your thoughts? I don't know. Are we? I think for most practicing Christians, that's been the wake-up call of this quarantine, is, do we continue to practice our religion when there's nowhere to go to practice it, to be seen of others? I wrote recently on the internet regarding something else, that integrity is what we do when we think no one is watching. And I have had some weeks that were better than others. Today was a good one. Last week was okay. I watched the 10 Commandments, which takes some poetic license with the story, but at least it got me thinking about that. And then when I was at my parents' house for dinner, I talked a little bit about the lesson with my mother. The family is always important. good memories are always important. People who care about us and who matter to us will always be important. Excuse me. Just before I started this video, I was just sitting there thinking about how grateful I am for this beautiful Sabbath day. It's 87 degrees outside in Vegas on the 7th of June. It's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. It's ironic because 76 years ago the weather was pretty much the same at D-Day. That was a beautiful day after a stormy day. And yesterday I was grateful for those who pointed out FDR's prayer as we talk about and think about publicity stunts and manipulating religion, because it's always right to pray. And just because the person praying may not be what you consider to be a righteous person doesn't mean that the prayer won't reach the Lord if some way it might benefit the righteous. Ooh, I like that. I should write that down. He is no respecter of persons. And that doesn't just mean those who speak. It means about those who might benefit. I don't think that God turns away any right gesture, even if done for the wrong reason, if it can benefit good people for the right one. You think about Eli and his sons in the Old Testament. And they were pretty wicked people. But he didn't punish all of Israel because Eli's two sons were nincompoops. Now, the people were blessed a lot more once Samuel took over the responsibilities of the tabernacle as the chief priest, but he didn't punish all of Israel because Eli was a lousy priesthood holder. And he won't punish you because your bishop sucks. He won't punish you if you don't think that the people between you and the top are doing the right thing, if you're doing the right thing, and if what they say, even if they don't mean it, might be the right thing for you. There are human frailties in every human. If not, what need would we have for a Savior? If not, why would there need to be a church to get together and buoy each other up and talk about the welfare of our souls and remember those who are not there and talk about what we can do to help them come back to Christ and put their lives together, make them whole once more? Do we have to worship God only on Sunday? No. Should we? Yes. If there's a building, we should go. I had a young gal I ministered to over 10 years ago now, because I've been in the house nearly that long. And in her first time she spoke in the congregation, she made this comment, and it has struck me ever since. She said, if we do not keep the commandments, it's because we don't love God enough to keep them. If we don't go to church on Sunday, it's because we don't love him enough to come to his house. That was pretty profound for someone as inexperienced and unlearned as she was in the ways of Christianity. Because like 4 or 5 months before that, she'd been an atheist. And she was a good young woman. I wonder what happened to her. Do we love God? Do we love God enough to tolerate the imperfections in our leaders? To get out of our comfort zones, dress up in our fine vestments, drive, I think my church building is like a mile away, to go to church. It's time to go back to church. Whether you've been gone just because of COVID-19 or you've been gone for other reasons, it's time to go back to church, because that's where we ought to be, so that we can continue to feel the way we used to feel and remember what made us believe in the first place. It's like anything else. You stop going to the gym, you lose muscle mass. You stop going to church, of course your testimony gets weaker. That which we persist in doing becomes easier. Not that the nature of the thing itself has changed, but that our ability to do so has increased. If you're not persisting in it, then you're getting weaker. Your spiritual muscles need a workout too. If you neglect to feed your spirit, you will reap unhappiness. And if during this quarantine you have not been nurturing your spirit, you're probably not enjoying it very much. And this is not to say that I'm doing a crap ton of things to, commune with Christ. I still am supposed to be here in front of my computer for work for the 8 hours I'm on the clock. I work on the house. I futz around. I go in each week and record videos of me doing laboratory exercises so I can post them to the internet so that students can see it done, at least, exactly the way it's outlined in their procedure, and then have actual raw data that's real, that I generated. Then I generated it, so I know the math, and I know they can't go on the internet and find the answers. They actually have to use my data. And then I put those videos together and post them up on the internet. And I told a woman, one of the course coordinators, who really appreciated it and nominated me for an award, I said it made me feel better about getting paid my full salary, knowing that I was working at least 2 full days a week for 5 days worth of pay. Because it's documented. It takes time. You know that I was at work because I'm on campus. But in a way, I think that was religious observance too. We owe a duty to be people of integrity. I was collecting a paycheck. I felt like I should earn it. And so I don't mind doing it, because I think God respects that too. We believe in being subject to kings, presidents, rulers, and magistrates, and obeying, honoring, and sustaining the law. That's what good Christians do. When the law is just, we obey it. Now, then we get into some ethical questions that are bigger than this video, but it's time to go back to church. Go back to church to feel the Spirit, to remind ourselves of what we committed to do, to be, to remind ourselves of the things we experienced that led us to that commitment in the first place. And it's time to go back to church, because there we show that we really mean it, because it takes some effort, and because we're much more likely to commune with Christ and talk about Christ if we go to church than we are if we go to the lake with our buddies, or go over to our friend's house, or go up on the mountain. Because I have done those things. But I do not see most people doing them. When they do it and they say it's their religious service. But if you don't start it with a prayer, was it religious? Anyway, some thoughts for the Sunday school lesson this week. I'll see if I'm motivated to do another one next week. I'm actually surprised I did this, because this was pretty spur of the moment. You can tell it wasn't scripted because my eyes are darting around and I ramble a little bit, because that's just how I do these videos. It's me. It's what I really think and what I really feel and what I really believe. I encourage you to share what you really think, what you really feel, and what you really believe with others, especially with the Savior. He wants you to talk to him like you know he cares about you. He wants you to talk to him like you would talk to your best friend. That's what he wants to be. That's the purpose of church, to get to know the best friend you'll ever have, as well as you can while you are here. So that when we see him, when we meet him, we shall see him as he is, because we shall be like him. Godspeed. Have a great week. Stay safe, stay healthy, and be wise. What can I say more?